Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the topic of this very special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, few Americans will ever rival the depth and the breadth of the service to our nation exhibited by George Herbert Walker Bush. Today, I join the Bush family, my colleagues, his fellow Texans, and a grateful nation in remembering and honoring the life of President George H.W. Bush. He was a courageous war hero, a key member of the Committee on Ways and Means while he was here in Congress, an ambassador, director of the CIA, vice president, and president of the United States. That is a remarkable and historic level of service to America. But I still think his favorite title was that of husband to his beloved Bar, and I believe his greatest accomplishment was it raising children and grandchildren who serve their nation with dedication and patriotism. I believe our country and our state can agree we've lost a man of honor and character who leaves a legacy and love of service to his nation and family. So today, we all want to share with you a little bit about our relationship with the beloved President Bush. I consider myself a proud part of the Bush legacy. On the Ways and Means Committee, I hold the seat that was previously held by President Bush, then a member of the Congress, and Bill Archer of Houston, later the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee from Texas. I am truly blessed to be part of a legacy on this committee that has achieved so much. In fact, my interest in major issues from trade to tax reform to health care is due in large part to President Bush. After I became elected to Congress, I spent a lot of time visiting President Bush and Secretary James Baker, asking their advice on these issues. And in fact, one of the reasons I've been involved in 12 of the 14 American Free Trade Agreements and led the Central American Free Trade Agreement was directly because of my discussions with President Bush and Secretary Baker. President Bush was incredibly supportive of me, both in my early campaigns for Congress and once I started serving. There was always an open door to talk about issues dealing in tax and trade, healthcare, welfare, Social Security, and Medicare. I always knew I had someone I could lean on for sage advice. Because I used to represent College Station, I had the pleasure of being in office. President Bush's library was opened at A&M, and worked close with the foundation for the 8 years I represented it. The library is remarkable, but it goes way beyond the bricks and mortar. It is a tangible reminder of the impact President Bush had on College Station in the state of Texas. The library brought world leaders to College Station, allowed young men and women from the small towns in Texas to interact with President Bush as well as United States and world leaders on a one-on-one, close, personal level. That incredible legacy for those young people will last for ages to come. I'll finish with this. One of my favorite moments with President Bush came just after I was named Ways and Means Chairman. President Bush's office reached out and said the president wanted me to come down to his office in Houston and visit about Ways and Means issues. So you'd imagine I was thrilled about it. So I went to his office, and my staff really urged me to take a pair of crazy socks to present to President Bush because he loved them, and he wore them. I had a lot of fun with them. So I decided instead to bring one of 3 specially made Ways and Means ties that we had just created. I brought that to the president, and he seemed thrilled. But it was Barbara who was most excited. And when I wanted the tie, she exclaimed, "Thank God, no more socks, please." I'll finish, too, with this. Finally, every Veterans Day and Memorial Day, as I address our events in the 8th Congressional District of Texas, I often conclude with my most memorable quote from President Bush. It's a quote that's emblazoned in the library in College Station, letters 10 feet tall, right where the Brazos Valley sun can catch it every day and afternoon on the library. And the quote is this: "Let future generations understand the blessings and burdens of freedom. Let them say we stood where duty required us to stand." That quote embodies President George H.W. Bush, and it's a call to us as well to stand where duty requires us to stand today, in all things and in the future. Mr. Speaker, I will yield the balance of the time to the gentleman from Texas, Congressman Roger Williams, a dear friend of President Bush for more than 3 decades. a partner and a colleague and a huge admirer. I yield to Mr. Williams. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing us this time.
Gentleman will suspend. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for the remainder of the hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reminded of a time when in Texas we were in a breakfast and we had two groups. We had a group that was very close to Jeb Bush, the governor of Florida, and one that was close to George W. Bush, and Mrs. Bush was our guest speaker. And she spoke, and when she opened up for questions, one of the questions was that Mrs. Bush, a lot of us in here know Jeb better than George. We know George better than Jeb. How are they alike? How do they differ? And Mrs. Bush said she's been blessed to have a great family, but she said these words. She said, "You could put all my boys together, and they would not equal their father." I thought that was powerful. So on November 30th, 2018, America lost a great servant, and I lost a great friend. President Bush epitomized everything wonderful about America. And like his country, he was tough, strong, and kind. Over the years, I was able to get to know the President and his family very well. My family and I had the opportunity to visit them in Kennebunkport many summers. Our days were spent playing basketball and sailing on the water, sharing and listening to President Bush's stories until the sun went down. I remember one basketball game, my daughters were playing, and they didn't have any tennis shoes, and Mrs. Bush went and got her tennis shoes and gave them to my daughters. And when they began to shoot, there was vines that had grown up on the basketball goal. And she made the president get hedge clippers and clip the vines down before the girls could shoot baskets. What a man he was. I'm grateful for those priceless moments with President Bush that exist only now as memories and great memories. In addition to traveling together as friends, we also shared a love for baseball. And I was proud to be awarded with his award, the George H.W. Bush Distinguished Alumnus Award by the National College Baseball Hall of Fame. And to this day, I wear a ring that has his name on it. It was during our baseball days that something very interesting happened. We were having lunch one day in his office at College Station, and it was myself and President Bush and Gene Becker, his chief of staff, and Drayton McClain, who owned the Astros. And President Bush, just out of nowhere, said, "I need to bring something up that I've gotten no credit for." And Ms. Becker said, "Oh, don't go there, Mr. President." He said, "No, I'm going to go there. There's plenty of time between that." He said, "I said a statement that I get no credit for, and that statement is you the man." And he explained that he was at an Astro game it was actually the Colt 45s in 1961, and they had a player named Rusty Staub. And Rusty Staub wanted to meet President Bush. And so after the game, Staub came toward President Bush, or then he was not president, and President Bush said, "I don't know why I said it, don't know what it meant, but when he came closer to me, I said, 'You the man.'" And Drayton McClain said, "Well, if you haven't got any credit for it, we'll put it on. We're playing the Dodgers tomorrow night. We'll put it on the Diamond Vision, your picture, and we'll put you the man." And the next night they did, and he got that credit for you the man. So I would just say to the President, I think we'd all agree, Mr. President, you the man. Now, we had a relationship that was very unique and very dear to my heart. This great man served as a mentor to me and had a huge impact on my life. In fact, he was the reason I'm standing here before all of you today. When I was contemplating running to represent Texas' 25th Congressional District, I called President Bush for advice. He encouraged me to run and gave me the push that I needed. I'll never forget it. Years ago, I announced my congressional campaign in his office, with him by my side, sitting next to me, and the rest in my world is history. So I'm forever grateful to President Bush. He has been an inspiration throughout my life. He's been like a father. Whether it be in my faith or in my path to public service, he was very kind to me. He was the first person to call me while I was in the hospital after the baseball shooting back in June of 16. And he said he was praying for me and praying for our team. And 2 days later, he called to check on me again. the phone to offer his sage wisdom when I called and give me his advice, and I truly miss him terribly. Over a week has gone by now that our country has been without one of the greatest Americans to ever live. This is a immeasurable loss for America, but I'm comforted knowing that he has been reunited with his beloved Barbara and their daughter Robin. It has been a true honor to experience life with President Bush in it. Our country is better because of him, and I'm better because of him, and my family is better because of him. And he once said, and we've all heard it, public service is the most noble calling of all, and he answered that call. So each and every day I'm praying for the entire Bush family, as we all are, and I hope they find peace during this difficult time. One more story. We were in Fort Worth one day, and he spoke, and he found out one of our civic leaders was not doing well from a health standpoint. We got in the car, and he had his cell phone, and he dialed the number. And the lady that worked in the house answered the phone, and he asked to speak to this gentleman. She held a minute, and the wife of this gentleman got on the phone and said, he said, "This is President Bush. I'd like to speak to your husband." She says he cannot speak. He says, "Well, take this phone into his bedroom right now, and I want to tell him I love him." That's the kind of man President Bush was. So God bless President Bush. God bless his family. God bless America. I yield my time back. Okay, I now yield 2 minutes to Congressman Culberson, who I think represents where President Bush lives.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It is in 18 years, it's been my extraordinary privilege to represent the people of District 7. I've had the world's best role model, congressman. My predecessor, George H.W. Bush, was the first congressman to represent District 7. He, like just as he was to you, Roger, and as he was to Kevin, has been not only a role model to me, but an advisor and helped to guide me when I first decided to run for office. It has always been there for me to offer me advice every step of the way. He's an extraordinary role model, and everyone who knew him understood immediately that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. As Mark McKinnon remembers, George H.W. Bush will be remembered by history as a deeply accomplished public servant, but the many of us who were lucky enough to pass through his orbit will remember him for his uncommon grace and love towards family and friends. The editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly once said of George H.W. Bush that it's clear there's a narrative that runs through the Bush family. Be polite, treat people decently. And this came from his father, from his mother. They passed it on to their children. And as they passed it on, he remembers that every encounter I ever had with George W. Bush, whether it was Governor Bush or President Bush 43 or ex-President Bush, he was the same guy. He was very much his father's son. And all of us who are parents hope that whatever else we don't do right, the thing we do right is to convey the fundamental values of who we are and who we're supposed to be to our kids. One of the things that survives about George Bush the elder is the fact that he passed along to his own children that same decency, that same line of decency that he learned from his parents. In fact, when Jeb Bush once said, "How great is this country that it could elect a man as fine as our dad to be president." And if I may have just an extra 30 seconds, Mr. Williams, I want to add, I think if we remember what George W. said as he accepted the presidential nomination in the year 2000, President Bush 43 said as he accepted the nomination, "My father was the last president of a great generation. A generation of Americans who stormed beaches, liberated concentration camps, and delivered us from evil. Some never came home. Those who did put their medals in drawers, went to work, and built on a heroic scale. Highways and universities, suburbs and factories, great cities and grand alliances. The strong foundation of an American century. George H.W. Bush brought the Cold War to a peaceful conclusion, successfully managing the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and the end of the Soviet Union without provoking violence from communist bitter enders. In the first Gulf War, George H.W. Bush established that on his watch, America would not retreat from the world, but would intervene decisively when the global balance of power was in jeopardy. His life was spent in the service of his nation, and his spirit of conciliation, common sense, and love of country will stand him in strong stead through the ebbs and flows of posterity's judgment. On that score, that George H.W. Bush was a uniquely good man in a political universe where good men are hard to come by, there was bipartisan consensus a quarter century after he left the White House. We will miss this great good man, and America and Texas are far, far better that he lived and he served his nation so well. I yield back. Thank you.
Now acknowledge the Dean of our Texas delegation, Congressman Barton.
Thank you. I think it is a measure of President George H.W. Bush that we all think of him as a personal friend. It's literally true that he had tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of men and women who considered themselves personal friends. I felt I was very close to the president, although obviously not as close as Mr. Williams, who went to Kennebunkport and really knew the family. I knew the president first as vice president. When I was a White House fellow, it was Vice President Bush who had a reception in the White House and gave my class their White House Fellow certificates. As a candidate, one of the reasons that I'm here today is because he took a personal interest in me. We had an event that we had planned for myself in Fort Worth, but the NRCC decided that I couldn't win, and they gave that date and that time to Dick Armey. And they did the event at Denton, Texas, instead of in Fort Worth for Dick Armey, and I was so mad that I crashed his event. And I went up to the security checkpoint, and they wouldn't let me in, and I asked to speak to the advance team, and the head of the advance team was a gentleman named Ron Kaufman. And Ron knew me, and he said, well, Joe, that's pretty unusual. This is really for Dick Armey. But he went and talked to the vice president, and the vice president said, sure. And so I got on the stage with Roger Staubach and Dick Armey and the vice president. I was only there for about 3 minutes, but my picture and the video was in the TV market that night. And the vice president asked me to go to Houston, and I had Montgomery County, and so I went down. He flew, but I drove, and I got to be in that rally that night. When he was going to Texas A&M as president, I represented A&M, and I got invited to fly on Air Force One with Senator Graham to Texas A&M, and I wore my Texas A&M tie. And as we were sitting up in the presidential cabin of Air Force One, I noticed that the president had on a hand-woven, beautiful silk tie. I noticed that Senator Graham had on an old cheap polyester tie. And Senator Graham looked at me and he said, Joe, you ought to give your tie to the president. And I volunteered to give my Texas A&M tie to the president, which I did. But then Senator Graham took the president's hand-woven silk tie, and I ended up with Graham's polyester tie. And the president said, well, Joe, you're the junior man here. You just have to suck it up. But later that week in Fort Worth, Senator Graham and I were at a fundraiser for the Republican women, and I noticed he was wearing the president's hand-woven silk tie. And so at the end of the event, I stood up and I said, now, ladies, we need to raise some more money, and we auctioned off the president's tie, and Phil Graham had to be a good sport, and I think we got $2,000 for it. When Bush was president, he was a strong supporter of the Super Collider project in my district. I invited him to come to Ellis County to tour it. He did. I got to ride on Air Force One. I got to ride on Marine One and show him the project. And he had on a hard hat, said President Bush, President George Bush. And when he went back to the helicopter, as he got out of the presidential motorcade, he threw his hat on the back seat. And I said, Mr. President, can I have that hard hat? And he said, well, keep it for me until the next time I come down here to open the SSC. As we all know, he got defeated for election, and President Clinton didn't strongly support the SSC, and it was killed. But I still have that hard hat. After he left office and a decision was made to put the Bush Library at Texas A&M, I put a bill on the floor that got $15 million to set up the Bush Fellows at Texas A&M, and I'm very, very, very proud of that. The last story I'll tell is that in my reelection in 1986, I was the #1 target in the state of Texas and one of the top 10 targets in the country. The vice president called me and said, "Would you like me to do an event?" And of course I said yes. We did that event in Fort Worth. Fran and Eddie Childs headlined it and hosted it, and we raised, I believe, over $200,000, which in that time and era for me was a lot of money. And the vice president spent a lot of time there and was very gracious to my family, to my parents. He invited my mother and father to the White House when he was president for the White House Christmas ball, and that was one of the highlights of their lives. So to the Bush family, thank you for sharing the president with us all these years. And as I said at the start, you know, it is a measure of an individual when he has so many people that consider themselves to be personal friends. And my guess is President Bush has more of those types of individuals than just about anybody else in the country. So God bless the late President Bush. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next is Chairman Lamar Smith, San Antonio.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from Texas, Roger Williams, for yielding me time. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commemorate the life and public service of our 41st President, George Herbert Walker Bush. President Bush was simply one of the most honorable people I've ever met in or out of politics. And as a fellow Texan, I was privileged to know and work with him over years. One of my happiest memories was when I was a junior member of Congress and I was invited by the President to accompany him on Air Force One. This was my first flight. And we went down to my hometown of San Antonio for the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. After we were in the air, the President asked me to join him and the First Lady, Barbara Bush, in the forward cabin. I expected the visit to last about 5 minutes, but instead ended up spending the entire 2.5-hour flight with them all the way down. I have to say that I felt a twinge of guilt because I felt like he should have been spending this time making phone calls or writing those well-known personal notes that he was famous for. This was an election year, and certainly he could have taken my support for granted. But instead, this gesture on his part, I think, showed his big heart and how gracious and friendly he was. Earlier this year, I arranged for a tree to be planted on the Capitol grounds to honor President Bush. It was the first tree to be dedicated to a president. His selfless public service and commitment to family continues to be a worthy example for all of us. Now I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Yes, sir. Next is Congresswoman Kay Granger, Fort Worth.
George H.W. Bush was a giant of a man, a decorated naval aviator who nearly lost his life in World War II, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president, and most notably, president of the United States. But more than any of that, he's someone to admire because he spent his life dedicated to serving his country and his fellow man. His dedication to his country was only rivaled by his dedication to his family, marked by his 73-year marriage to his wife Barbara and his loving relationships with his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. As important as he was, he took time to greet people who came to see him. He knew the value of a written note of praise and a hug and a handshake. He laughed as well as he led and knew the importance of relationships. Those who didn't have the privilege of knowing President Bush personally were given a glimpse of his character through the words of his loved ones Wednesday during his memorial service. As his son, President George W. Bush, said, who has the same sense of family and dedication to the nation, He said of his father, "Your decency, sincerity, and kind soul will stay with us forever. So through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man." George H.W. Bush's greatness shows in the strength of his family, and he's given us all a lesson in how to be a good friend. President Bush accomplished much in his long life. He epitomized what it means to be a public servant, and I'm honored to recognize this distinguished Texan today and thank you for his service to our country.
Next is Congressman Michael Burgess from Denton County.
Well, thank you. Thank the gentleman from Texas, and I thank him for bringing us together for this hour to pay tribute to an American hero who served on the front lines of our nation's history for really almost a century. From the skies of the Pacific to the Yale baseball diamond, to the oil fields of Texas, to the floor of the United States House of Representatives, to the streets of Beijing and the halls of the White House, President George Herbert Walker Bush led a life of humble leadership, courage, and conviction. Over 5 decades, an unmatched resume. His accomplishments, while impressive on their own, are extraordinary when bundled together. After the war, he left his New England home to move his young family to West Texas, where he pursued an oil career and later served the people of the 7th Congressional District here in the United States House of Representatives. As a leader, President Bush faced some of the greatest challenges of his time. He worked to open new paths of diplomacy in China. He helped to restore confidence in the Central Intelligence Agency, and he worked alongside President Reagan to make America great. Though he's perhaps better known for making waves overseas, our 41st president achieved new heights at home when he opened new doors for Americans with disabilities. While President Bush had a robust resume stacked with prestigious jobs at critical times in American history, most of us will remember him from the roles he held most dear. For 73 years, President Bush was a devoted husband of Barbara Pierce, a legend in her own right, with whom he built an honorable family of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Together, President and Mrs. Bush wove their own story of the American dream. There is no doubt that President Bush made the state of Texas, the United States of America, and the global community a better place to live. On behalf of my constituents in the 26th District of Texas, I thank him for his matchless service for our country, and I join a grateful nation to thank the Bush family for sharing him with us. And I yield back.
Next, one of our great veterans, Congressman Pete Olson.
And I thank my friend from Texas 25 for setting up this special order for a great American, George Herbert Walker Bush, back home known as Bush 41. There are many words which describe his life: statesman, dignified, hero, father, husband, devoted leader, and human being. My wife Nancy and I met him twice in very relaxed settings in Houston, Texas. We loved how funny he was. He loved to make people laugh. He and I talked about being former naval aviators, running back home in the Houston area for Congress. Both of us had a big problem with our first campaign. We weren't born in Texas. We weren't native Texans. Some called us carpetbaggers. President Bush had the best reply I've ever heard. To paraphrase, he said, "It's true, my friend. I wasn't born in Texas, but on my birthday, it was very important that I was with my mother." And sadly, my mom was not in Texas on June 12th of 1924. I wish I'd had the wisdom of that line when I ran in 2008. He loved having fun with his soulmate, Barbara Bush. Married for 73 years, the first woman he ever kissed. And check out this photo. That's President Carter and Rosalind, President Ford and Betty, Lady Bird Johnson, and President George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. Guess who has rabbit ears? Our First Lady, Barbara Bush. George Bush never let the job take over his humanity. A final story about President Bush having fun. We have the same photographer back in Houston. He's been with the Bush family for about 40 years. As President Bush's health faded, went there one fall to take some pictures for Christmas. I asked my friend, how's the president doing? He said, he's doing fine, his brain is great, but he can't walk anymore. He's wheelchair bound, and we take a photo every year with the First Lady after they come back home from Kennebunkport for photos for Christmas and for the entire year. Those shoots have become very, very tough. I can't stand him up. He has to sit down in his wheelchair. He was 6'2", 6'3". Barbara was probably 5'7". He towered over her in real life. In the wheelchair, she towered over him. So how do you fix that? I work the First Lady out hard, is what she said. I'm going to squat down, get on her knees so she's below him as they've been their whole life. And to try to hide that wheelchair from the photos, I put her up to the left down low, to the right down low, behind to the right down low, behind to the left down low, moved her all over. They started laughing and said what made their love so special, so dear, they're both at 90 years old, and as our First Lady walked in front of our president about 10 times, she stopped and said, George, stop that. Stop that. Our president was pinching her behind out of love. There's good news today for the Bush family. President Bush and Barbara are walking hand in hand with their daughter Robin in heaven right now. I'll close by saying the last 4 words President Bush said when he was with us. He said these words to our President George W. Bush, so-called Bush 43. He said, and I quote, I love you too. He said that to George W., but we all know he said that to every American, every person in this world. This man loved life. He loved America. He loved humanity. He's a great man. Rest well in heaven and have fair winds and following seas. I yield back. Thank you.
Next is Dr. Brian Babin.
Thank you very much. Our nation lost a true patriot on November the 30th with the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush. Our 41st president ascended to the office with an impeccable resume for the position. Having served as congressman, ambassador to China, CIA director, vice president to our 40th president, Ronald Reagan. His service as a Navy pilot during the Second World War, during which he was shot down over the Pacific, cemented his status as an American hero. But the humble Bush rarely referenced his war experiences. Indeed, President Bush rarely discussed his own record. His accomplishments as president, particularly on the world stage, seem more impressive with the passing of time, and historians and scholars hold his administration in increasingly high esteem. I met President Bush only once, but still treasure the photograph that I had taken with him. He was a real gentleman. Despite a life spent in public service at the highest levels, President Bush was a devoted family man. He was constantly surrounded by his loved ones. His children adored him, and his relationship with his wife, Barbara, has long been celebrated for his commitment and its warmth. The people of Texas, which became his adopted home after his service in the Navy, will forever hold President Bush in special regard. George Bush led an exemplary life. His service to his country and his kindness to his fellow Americans ranks him among our most beloved of presidents. His reputation as a loving husband and father will persist, and I believe that his legacy as president will continue to grow after his passing. Thank you for your service. Rest in peace, Mr. President.
Next is a gentleman that represents a very large district in Texas, Congressman Will Hurd.
I'd like to thank my friend and colleague for arranging this conversation. I want to join my colleagues and a mourning nation today as we continue to honor the legacy of President George H.W. Bush, a giant of a man that we should all aspire to be. He's also a man of integrity who focused on his family and his faith. He was a loving and caring husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather who treated his friends and his foes with kindness, civility, and respect. I will be forever grateful that he fell in love with Texas A&M University, my alma mater, because that is where I had the opportunity of meeting and becoming friends with the late president. He encouraged me to join the CIA and had a lasting impact on me and many of my peers to answer the call to service and work towards causes greater than ourselves. I will be forever grateful for him instilling this spirit in me. 41 was the epitome of a public service and a beacon of light in this world, embodying America at its best. Rest in peace, Mr. President. Thank you for your selfless service, and thank you for being an example to us all. I yield back.
Next is Jody Arrington, Lubbock, Texas.
I want to thank the gentleman for hosting this special order, my friend Roger Williams and fellow Texan, to honor the life and legacy of President George Herbert Walker Bush. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of a great American and a proud Texan, President George Herbert Walker Bush. This past week, we as a nation said goodbye to a true statesman, and we reflected on a life of duty, honor, and above all, service to others. From one of the youngest Navy pilots in our nation's history to the leader of the highest office in the land, our 41st president's life was defined by service to others. And his dedication to our country was matched only by his love for and devotion to his family. Throughout his life, President Bush taught us that public service is a noble calling, and that being a politician and a gentleman aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. His example inspired countless other Americans to get involved in public service, which made a tremendous impact on many lives, such as myself, and no doubt has had an impact on this country and has made it a better and brighter place to live. Mr. Speaker, President Bush once said that he saw life in terms of missions. Missions defined and missions completed. Well, today, George Herbert Walker Bush's mission on earth is complete. And I join my friend President George W. Bush, the entire Bush family, and all Americans in celebrating a life well lived and rejoice with them and the promise of life everlasting. God has no doubt blessed this great country in many ways, but not the least of which is with men like George Herbert Walker Bush. God bless the Bush family, and God continue to bless America. I yield back.
Next is Congressman Doug LaMaffa from California.
Well, I thank my colleague from Texas, Mr. Williams, for leading this tonight, and he finally ran out of Texans to present here, so we're now up to California. So I'm honored to be able to be here tonight to join in the commemoration and celebration of President Bush 41. When he was looked to for leadership, he came through in spades. I recall mostly, I think one of the strongest moments indeed was during the Gulf War Desert Storm. And his steady hand was what was needed at a very perilous time for our allies and neighbors in the Middle East that were counting on us, but also the ability to keep the coalitions that America had been built over so many years, and indeed form that coalition that helped us be successful on the world stage in that effort. And so that leadership, you know, he exuded the leadership. I love the photograph, I think, the best of him. He's standing there in that bomber jacket looking off in the distance. And just that photo exudes confidence and gives us confidence in him as a leader at that time when it was so very perilous. He's a good man. He learned from mistakes that happened, and he built upon them to be successful. As a president, and I think most importantly, he would say, as a family man. Indeed, when we all viewed the service for him last week here, that beautiful family that he is so proud of really is a legacy that he can be proud of, along with Barbara. That's the most important legacy. But also, in what he brought to the office, civility. Something that might be a little short-handed in the dealings in Washington, D.C. these days. Brought civility, he brought respect for the office, for the institution, and the interactions. Indeed, his ability to work across the aisle and post-presidency, work with people that had been his opponents previously for causes that were bigger than all of us. He showed the way, he showed the light when he talked about the 1,000 points of life and being able to accomplish and help others post-presidency. His sense of adventure, jumping out of perfectly good airplanes at each birth date or landmark and birth date. I mean, that's something else. And that makes me smile, and I think mostly he had a sense of humor. You saw it in his son, George W. as well, and you see it all the time. But he could take a joke and give one out, and I just always, one of my favorite things would be him interacting with Dana Carvey on the Saturday Night Live skits there, and him playing along because he saw the fun in it. He saw the humor in it when people chalked him up as a combination of John Wayne and Mr. Rogers, and how he carried himself, and the whole Nagada thing that he interacted with Dana Carvey, and it just showed a well-rounded, great man this man was and is, and that we're appreciative of the opportunity to commemorate him and his service in all capacities and all phases of his life. So God bless him. God bless the whole Bush family, and thank you for this time.
Next is Congressman French Hill from Arkansas.
I thank my friend from Texas for coordinating this opportunity to stand in solidarity on the House floor and memorialize a dear family friend and my former boss, George Herbert Walker Bush, our 41st president. President Bush was a great sportsman, a man of warm and goofy humor, a man who in every instance put himself in the position of serving others. From his willingness to enlist and become the Navy's youngest aviator, a braviator indeed he was, flying some 58 continents. But at every stage of his life until he passed on to be with Barr and Robin on November 30th at the age of 94, Bush, 41, continued to put himself in the position of serving others. That is his legacy. from helping spread 1,000 points of light, Americans helping Americans helping the less fortunate, Americans reaching out across the ocean and help those in time of need. As I noted, he was a great sportsman. He loved speed, fast boats like the Fidelity, fast planes like his Avenger, the Barbara III. That's right, 3. It was said to be Grumman's best customer after losing 3 planes as a naval aviator. And even in sports that were known for being relaxing, Mr. Williams, he made them fast. 18 holes of ready golf, or cart polo, as it was referred to, in minutes, not hours. Super competitive doubles tennis, fishing, always loving fishing, that is, when he wasn't skydiving. But this sportsman, gentleman, servant leader accomplished an extraordinary portfolio of successes in his single term of 4 years as our president. Called upon by the media and many to dance atop the crumbled Berlin Wall, President Bush did not dance, but instead put his shoulder down and produced an agreement that in turn produced the extraordinary growth and prosperity among the peoples of Europe. No greater memorial to this success than to walk down the streets today of Warsaw, Prague, or Budapest and see the economic vitality of free market capitalism at work. But there were other exceptional moments in the international portfolio, including the completion of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the reinforcement of the Monroe Doctrine by ejecting a threatening thug, Manuel Noriega, from Panama, the delicate punishment of China while balancing our relationship during the regime's horrible, murderous actions at Tiananmen Square, and ending the years of tension between the United States and our ally, Japan, by creating the Structural Impediments Initiative that opened Japanese markets by removing non-tariff barriers to American exports and services. On the domestic front, this man of the House, Bush 41, was an outstanding creative agenda, starting by cleaning up the failure of the S&L crisis of the 1980s. He proposed the Americans for Disability Act that was accepted by Congress and has provided millions of Americans with more opportunities for work and access. His Clean Air Amendment set the standard in the world for cleaning up acid rain challenges using market mechanisms benefiting not only America, but our neighbor to the north, Canada. He left office with a reputation of constraining government spending and responsible budgeting. But of course, along the way, there were heartbreaks, beginning with the failure to have his close friend, Senator John Tower, confirmed as Secretary of Defense for ridiculous, spurless, partisan reasons. But on Capitol Hill, President Bush 41 struggled with the incredible partisanship from Senate Leader George Mitchell and House Majority Leader Dick Gephardt, but he treasured his friendships of cooperation and success with members like John Murtha, Dan Rostenkowski, and Speaker Tip O'Neill. Mr. Speaker, George Bush 41 treasured God, faith, and family. He prided himself in the Army mantra of duty, honor, and country. In his memorial service at Washington National Cathedral, historian John Meacham stated that he believed Bush 41 was striving every day to justify why he'd been saved on that day at Chichijima. Thus, his focus on service and, well, his commandments, don't blame others, always share credit, warm admonitions from his beloved mom. So, Mr. Speaker, I stand today with my friends from Texas to salute George Bush, a good and faithful servant who ran a full and fast life. I was lucky to know him, work for him, and recognize him for being the exceptional man of character that he was. Our country is blessed to have him as our Commander-in-Chief and our 41st President of the United States. I thank my friend from Texas, and I yield back.
Just for the remaining speakers, we have 12 minutes left. Next is Rick Allen from the state of Georgia.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and talk about someone who we've talked about, we could for some time now, but we could talk about for a very long time. It is with a heavy heart that I rise this evening along with my colleagues to recognize the life and legacy of a true American statesman and patriot, our late President George H.W. Bush. My association with President Bush was through my hometown of Augusta, home of the Masters Tournament, founded by the greatest amateur golfer of all time, Bobby Jones. The Walker Cup, played by teams of the best amateur golfers from the United States and Great Britain and Ireland every 2 years, was named after President Bush's grandfather and his namesake. I got to know President Bush. He was the first honorary chairman of the First Tee organization. The sole purpose of the First Tee organization is to give those young people who do not have otherwise the economic means to play the game of golf the opportunity to play this great game. President Bush is also only one of 2 presidents to be inducted into the World Golf Hall. He led a life of utmost distinction, and the family and friends he leaves behind will always cherish the valuable time spent with this American hero. As he is reunited with his wife Barbara and their daughter Robin in heaven, we will continue to learn by his example always. And I tell you, those young folks who are playing golf now and learning those values, much appreciated as well. Rest in peace, Mr. President, and I yield back.
Congressman Randy Weber from Texas.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, George Herbert Walker Bush asked all of us to be light in this world, to be gracious, to be diligent, and to be honest. And then he led the way by example. His patriotism was innate. It was his guiding light, Mr. Speaker. And Barbara was his soulmate, his compass, part of his true north. Mr. Speaker, George H.W. Bush was one of our last great statesmen, a member of the greatest generation. His love for his nation was bested only by his love for his family. This enduring love for both is how we will long remember George H.W. Bush, Mr. Speaker, and oh, that we would emulate him. President Bush could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they belonged. He was the epitome of the true Southern gentleman, even though he wasn't born in the South. The South did adopt him, however, I might add, Mr. Speaker. His mannerisms and his convictions gained him respect far and wide, worldwide, in fact. This great and good man brought us together and led the way once again in that during our time of mourning his passing, his example quieted some of the divisiveness which is on display all too often, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot to learn from his mission and his life. Oh, that we would emulate him in that. Last week, George H.W. Bush arrived at his final, kindest, gentlest resting place with Barbara and Robin. He is homed. Mission accomplished, Mr. President. George Herbert Walker Bush, Mr. Speaker, is worth emulating. Oh, that we would all do so. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Next is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join my colleagues tonight in what is a tribute to George Herbert Walker Bush and Barbara Bush, a tribute of which I hope we will continue to live. It is my great honor to salute President Bush and to be reminded of the beauty of his love of 73 years, a partnership of service, raising a family, and serving a nation. Last week's tribute of mourning, memorials, and funerals was an opportunity for not only the nation but the world to learn of the depth and the level of integrity and honesty and statesmanship and leadership of our 41st president. I'm glad to have known him as a Houstonian. Delighted to have worked with his wife, Barbara Bush, on her great commitment to everyone should have the ability to read. Literacy was the standard bearer by which she guided her later life, and so many people learned to read and cherish books because of her service. I got to know the president more closely because of the relationship with my husband, Dr. Elwyn C. Lee. What most people don't know is preceding the Honorable Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland, parts of the 18th Congressional District, of which I represent, was represented by this young man, this young congressman, by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush, African Americans in a segregated Houston. Beloved because of his eagerness to treat everyone as a human being. One of his dear friends, who turned 90 in a couple of weeks, Reverend Dr. F.M. Williams, the pastor of the Antioch Baptist Church. He still is that pastor. And I remember standing next to him in Acres home when then President Herbert Walker Bush landed his big helicopter right there in our community, showing and affirming the friendship. We further enjoyed the opportunity to know him, my husband, through his assisting him to his own high school, Andover Academy, and how kind he was to send from China a gift for our. So he is more than the President of the United States, the Congressman, the chair of the RNC, the envoy, among others, the Vice President, the Director of the CIA, and most of all, the hero of World War II, when he, in his effort to fight for this nation, also as he was shot down, looked to save his colleagues. He is a hero. He is a friend. He is a man that we will honor and continue to honor. And by our lives and by our service, we hope to affirm both the wonderful life of his lovely bride as well as himself, and to say to his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and others, rest well. Thank you for sharing him with us, for he did serve his nation, and by that, he has served the people of this nation. May God bless as I yield back.
Congressman Ted Yoho from the state of Florida.
Thank you. I appreciate you putting this together. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this time to honor the late President George Herbert Walker Bush, our 41st President of the United States, and express our condolences to the Bush family. President Bush accomplished many policy objectives during his nearly 30 years in government, but I believe his greatest legacy is in his complete devotion to this nation and its people. In and out of office, President Bush dedicated his life to public service and helping others. He belonged to that era of Americans known as the greatest generation. Whether it was serving in the U.S. Navy during World War II or achieving the highest office in the land, President Bush never failed to demonstrate selflessness and compassion. When faced with conflicts and adversity, President Bush always responded with grace and honor. He lived at a time when Americans and America knew who were. His lifetime of service was rightfully recognized in 2011 when he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Even though he is no longer with us, his legacy of kindness and self-sacrifice will live on. As we transition into the 116th Congress, I'd like us to remember President Bush for his complete devotion to this country and its citizens. It's an honor to have a career in public service, and I'm grateful our country had a role model like President Bush, and I hope my colleagues in Congress feel the same. At a time in history when the nation feels divided, we must remember those who have stood before us and worked to bring the American people together for the good of the country. The alignment he had in life is a simple one. In fact, our nation would be better served if we followed it. It's God, country, and family. I ask that we honor late President Bush. We remember his encouragement to work hand in hand with our neighbors to give back to our communities and to our country. The American people are lucky to have such a compassionate and honorable leader and will forever be grateful for his service to this great country.
Faith, family, and friends, we may never see the likes of George H.W. Bush again, although we hope we do. Praise the Lord for the President. Praise the Lord for his family. In God we trust. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Yield. We hit it round the button, didn't we?